Route summarization has similarities to some of the IGPs that we've previously discussed, but there are some distinctive aspects in the way BGP actually operates. So we want to look at how route summarization operates in BGP. We're going to start with, why do you want to summarize routes? What's the point? Why do it? How to configure summary route BGP, and then finally how to verify the existence and the successful configuration of summary routes in the BGP protocol. So the first question is, why summarize routes at all? We've talked about this previously. Optimal routing protocols will summarize whenever possible. And the reason why is because you don't get points for having bigger routing tables. In fact, larger routing tables take more time to process, they require more memory, and they require more CPU cycles. So the smaller a routing table, the more efficient everything can be. So positive aspects of route summarization, as I just mentioned, it shrinks the size of the routing table. It also reduces the scope of the routing table as well. In EIGRP specifically, it will shrink query scopes, and in BGP, it just simply means that the path that's been constructed is going to be shrunk down a little bit. For example, when we talked about BGP path attributes, there was the aggregator attribute and the atomic aggregate attribute, where path information has been lost. Well, when a route is summarized, some of the path information becomes lost. Now, the aggregator attribute points to the router that did the aggregation, but in essence, it shrinks the size of a particular AS path. Summary routes frequently carry the best metric. In BGP, this is just simply a matter of adjustment. These are just some general principles. Again, potential drawbacks, less than optimal routing. And if for some reason the networks that are contained within the summary are not reachable, you're going to have packet discards. Now, as we'll discover later, you have to have at least one route in the routing table that's represented by the summary, but it's not going to check to see if all of the routes that are potentially there are contained in the routing table. So if there's a particular route in the range that's not represented or it's offline, you may end up with packet discards. And pictured to the left is a great example. You've got the 192.168.10 through 15.0 that can be represented by a single prefix, the 192.168.00/20. Configuring summary routes in BGP, the syntax is different than it is in some of the other protocols. For instance, area range and summary address in OSPF, and the summary address per interface in EIGRP. In BGP, it is the aggregate address command. And under the BGP configuration mode, router BGP ASN number, the title aggregate address, the prefix, then whatever the mask is, and I'll explain the summary only command in just a minute. One of the things that the aggregate address command will do is, as a lot with the other routing protocols, it will create a route to null zero, a summary route in BGP. You will see that if you do a show IP route BGP, you will see the route listed, the prefix listed, but it will route to null zero. And that's something you can use for verification later on the originating router. Now, you can have BGP announce the summary in addition to the other routes. For instance, on the left, you could have BGP, for example, announce not just the 192.168.00/20 summary route or aggregate address, but it can also advertise all the other ones as well. When you use the summary only command, it will suppress the more specific prefixes. So for instance, if you configured aggregate address 192.168.00 and then 255.255, so forth for the prefix, then the keyword summary only after that, only the 192.168.00 is going to be advertised. All the rest will be removed from the routing table and suppressed. You can obviously also have a multiple amount of aggregate addresses. For instance, in the ISP that I originally worked for when I started in the business, there was a summary address configured, an aggregate address configured of 216.145.0.0 and then 255.255.252.0, which essentially was the /19 prefix, which you can still find in the routing tables on the internet. So it just gives you an example of how the aggregate address entry works. You have a number of different commands at your disposal to be able to verify successful configuration of your BGP route summarization. First, show IP route BGP. Remember, this is the show IP route command with the BGP qualifier, so it'll list only the BGP routes. Remember that eBGP routes will have an administrative distance of 20 by default. iBGP routes by default will have an administrative distance of 200. This is just another loop prevention mechanism. It will show all of the routes unless they've been suppressed. That's the aggregate address summary only command. You can also look at the specific prefix with more details with a show IP route and then the specific prefix. To use the example I talked about earlier, going to the AT&T route server, for example, show IP route 216.145.0.0, and it'll list all the details available at the route. It'll say it's a summary, for example, an aggregate address. On the originating router, if you do the show IP route and then the summary prefix, you should see a route to null zero. If you don't, and it's on the originating router, you need to check some other things to make certain it's been configured correctly. And then finally, the show IP BGP will show you the contents of the routing information base, and you should see the summary in there as well.